Almost 2 years ago, I was introduced to a 37-year-old man named Vinh Chung. Vin's a man of Chinese ancestry who wanted to tell his family story and asked me if I would write the book for him. I told Vin that I'm not a memoirist. I've written books on marriage and books on murder, but I've never written a memoir. And then Vin told me his family's story. Vin was born in Vietnam just 8 months after South Vietnam's fall to the communists in April of 1975. The Chung family lived in the Mekong Delta of Vietnam, and they were a very, very wealthy family. They were led by the matriarch, Grandmother Chung. Grandmother Chung was a 6-foot-tall Chinese woman at a time when the average Asian woman was 5 feet tall. Broad shoulders, long arms, thick hands, and fingernails that pointed to the ground like daggers. She could handle a machete like a Viet Cong regular. She had a stare so intense that people cleared the sidewalk when she walked down. All she had to do was look, and people would move for her. And she had the feminine habit of chewing betel nut. It's a concoction made of chopped up areca nut wrapped in a betel leaf with a pink calcium hydroxide powder that has the tendency to turn your teeth blood red. And as she'd walk down the sidewalk, she'd spit over her shoulder, and it looked like a jet of blood. Kind of added to her mystique. When Grandmother Chung was a young woman, a wife with 5 children, her husband died. Depression, alcoholism, leaving her with 5 children to raise all by herself and with no means of income. But this was one tough lady. And so she began by scraping together handfuls of rice and hand milling them and selling them, keeping some for money and then some to add to the bank in a way. And eventually, after 25 years of doing this, she had built a rice milling empire in the Mekong Delta that was worth tens of millions of dollars in today's dollars. They had everything. Now, Vin's father was a man named Tan. Tan, in 1966, took a wife. His wife's name was Hua, a beautiful Chinese word that means peace. He was 6'3" tall. Tan Chung, handsome, wealthy. He had everything. And if you ask him, and I did, what were you like as a young man? Wealthy, handsome, in the Mekong Delta. He said, I was a playboy. He took a mistress because it was common to do so if you were a handsome, wealthy young man in those days. Each time he had a child by his wife, he had a child by his mistress. Tan would tell you, I was not a very nice guy. Then the Vietnam War came along, and it didn't really concern the Chungs, because actually it was good for business. Because with the war came government orders for rice, and pretty soon the Chung Empire was shipping rice all over the Mekong Delta and up the ocean to Saigon, as far away as Saigon. It just made them wealthier. Once the Americans withdrew from Vietnam, the Chung family realized it was only a matter of time before South Vietnam would fall. They didn't really care. They didn't think it would affect them very much. After all, when Tan Chung was born, Vietnam was ruled by an emperor. So they had lived under French colonial rule. They had lived under the Japanese during World War II. They had lived under the French again. Then when Vietnam was split in 1954, they had lived in the South in a makeshift democracy. And so now the communists were going to take over? Big deal. They didn't expect it to affect life much, but it affected them much more than they knew. Because when the communists took over in 1975, they took everything the Chungs had. They took the rice mills, they took their house, made it into a civic building, took the cars, took the motorcycles, took everything they had. And the Chung family, which by that time was Tan and Hua and 8 children, and moved them to a tiny farm, a 10-acre farm that could be better called an orchard. And they were left there to eke out an existence for the next 4 years. That brings us to 1979, and in 1979, 2 interesting things happened. First, there was severe flooding in Vietnam. The economy was already a disaster. Vietnam was trying hard to get rid of the last vestiges of capitalism, and if you want to get rid of capitalism, you get rid of the Chinese, because they were the successful business people in Vietnam. They controlled banking, they controlled insurance, banking and transportation, and plus, Vietnam was having border conflicts with China. And when you're having border conflicts with China, you don't want a 5th column operating behind your borders. So they were expelling Chinese by 1979, and the Chung family was welcome to go. There was just one catch. The rule was you left everything else behind. You were allowed to take a couple $1,000s with you. Your property you signed over to the government with all future claim. So leaving Vietnam was a one-way trip. But the Chung family realized there was no future. Tan and Hoa realized their children would never have an education. They would never be able to have money once again. And they decided to leave. Now, leaving was a dangerous thing by 1979. The surrounding nations, Cambodia, Thailand, and as you see, Malaysia, had already taken in so many refugees that they were suffering from what some call compassion fatigue, tired of being nice. So they had all instituted a pushback policy. If you arrive on our shore, we push you back out to sea. The second problem was the Thai pirates. See, Thailand, you'll notice on the map, is shaped like a letter C. And Thai fishermen have fished in the Gulf of Thailand and the South China Sea for centuries. But fishing is hard and dangerous work, and it doesn't pay well. So when refugees began to flee from Vietnam in 1975, what the Thai fishermen realized is that they had converted all their currency into gold and jewels. Vietnamese currency would be no good when they moved to another country. Everything they had left in the world they were carrying with them, and there were no weapons on board their boats. So they were easy prey. So the fishermen decided it was much more lucrative to be a pirate than it was to be a fisherman. And the South China Sea became a virtual killing field, just like in Cambodia. So pirates would attack your boat, they would assault the women, they would take all the money, and then to make sure there were no witnesses, since piracy was a capital offense in some of the surrounding nations, they would ram your boat until it split in half and sink and drown all the people. To this date, nobody knows how many boat people actually perished at sea. It was estimated at the time that the death rate was 50%. For every 2 people that fled Vietnam, 1 died at sea. And yet the Chung family decided to go. In their family, the oldest was in his 70s, the youngest, 18-year-old twin boys. But they made a deal with 290 other people. They bought an old boat, patched it up as best they could, and in June of 1979, they sailed from the town of Kamau into the South China Sea with no particular destination in mind. But the wind and the currents took them to the east coast of Malaysia. The 60 Minutes TV show sent a film crew just a few months earlier to the east coast of Malaysia to capture this occurrence of all these refugees coming ashore on the east coast of Malaysia, fleeing from Vietnam. This is from 60 Minutes, and if you're old enough, you'll remember Ed Bradley. Remember him? Ed Bradley passed away in 2006. This is the very first episode he ever filmed for 60 Minutes. Do you have sound, guys?
You take a closer look. A boat, a flag, an arm waving. A crowd gathers along the beach. This is the east coast of Malaysia, final destination. Thousands of refugees fleeing Vietnam. Many don't make it this far. They're attacked by pirates, drown, or starve to death. These have made it. But will the Malaysian police turn them away? Or will they be stoned by local villagers? The crowd waits to see how many will survive this time. Only a few fishermen helped the boat people ashore. We joined in. As far as we could tell, no one drowned coming ashore,
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
and just for that, some were grateful.
Thank you, number one. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Very, very much, thank you very much.
Now, that footage is not the Chung family. It was shot just a few months before they arrived. But if you noticed the date in the lower right corner, June 24th of 1979, well, at that date, the air date of this episode, the Chung family at that time was on that same beach in Malaysia, and their arrival looked exactly like that. They arrived on the beaches of Malaysia. Too many refugees had arrived before them, so they were essentially imprisoned by the Malaysian soldiers. And for the next 2 weeks, they were marched down the beach. Every day, they would stop in a place that looked exactly like the day before. Eventually, after about 2 weeks, marching in the hot sun, poor Mrs. Chung, and all the stress and hurry and distraction of leaving Vietnam, had never even noticed the fact that she was pregnant with her second set of twins. And after all the forced march and almost nothing to eat or drink, she miscarried and lost her children. After 2 weeks, farther down the beach in Malaysia, they heard the good news. The Malaysian soldiers came back and said, "We are taking you to a refugee camp. Leave everything here. If you have any money left on you, turn it over to us. If we find anything on you that you've withheld, we will leave you on the beach to die. Take no food, take no water, you need nothing. The refugee camp is just a couple of hours away. We'll tell you there you'll have everything that you need once you get there." And so they split the Chung party of 290 into 4 little derelict fishing boats, none of them longer than 35 feet long. The immediate Chung family piled into a boat with a total of 93 people aboard. And a Malaysian patrol boat backed up to them, tied a rope to each of the boats, and began to tow them, not for 2 or 3 hours, but for 20 straight hours, out into the middle of the South China Sea, where just before dawn they cut the ropes and said, "You're on your own now," and left them to die. Now, on the other side of the world, in an exotic land called Los Angeles, there was a fledgling hunger relief organization called World Vision that used to be based in Monrovia, not far from here. The second president was in charge. He was a man named Stan Mooneyham. And in December of '77, Stan Mooneyham was scheduled to speak at a church in south central Los Angeles, pastored by a man named Ed Hill. Some of you have heard of Ed. They were meeting in the pastor's study before it was time for him to speak on that Sunday evening. Ed Hill tossed a copy of that day's LA Times across the desk to Stan and said, "What are you going to do about that?" And he pointed to this photograph of a boat person, frantic mother holding her dying daughter, looking to someone for help. Stan said, "What am I going to do? This is not my business. World Vision is a land-based organization." In fact, Stan said later he had never even heard of the boat people before because he had spent the previous year mostly in Africa doing hunger relief efforts there. But Stan said he could not get that photograph out of his mind. And though you've probably never seen that photograph before, you've probably seen another photo taken by the same photographer, a famous photojournalist named Eddie Adams. He's the one that took the photo of the South Vietnamese general executing the Viet Cong. Same photographer. Stan couldn't get that photo out of his mind and felt that God would have him do something. And so what Stan did is he went out and bought himself one of these. This is a 1,400-ton freighter that had been used to haul copra from the Philippines to Malaysia. He rechristened it with the name Sea Sweep, and he loaded it with food and water. He docked it in Singapore Harbor, and his goal was to sail around and find himself some boat people. So he set sail, sailed 400 miles up the coast of Malaysia, couldn't find a single boat person. That was frustrating. So instead, what he decided to do is turn due east and head across an area called Refugee Alley, because he was cutting off the angle there. If you look at the tip of the Mekong Delta, people heading south towards Malaysia, there were lots of boats that crossed that path, and he was likely to find one there. At the same time, what was happening with the Chung family is they were drifting, because what they discovered when they tried to start their engines on their little derelict fishing boats is that none of them worked. The block was cracked on theirs. The fuel was fouled with seawater. They were adrift. 4 boats on some of the other boats were extended members of the Chung family, including Grandmother Chung and many of their cousins. They tried to keep the boats rafted, tied together, but the weather was so bad, the boats were banging together so hard they were afraid they'd break apart. So they had to cut each other loose. And within one single day, they had all drifted across the horizon. The Chung family was alone. 6 days passed, no food and no water, and they were beginning to hallucinate. Some were close to death. There was a pregnant woman on board. The twin boys kept trying to struggle out of their mother's arms and jump in the ocean. The boat was surrounded by water, and their mother would not let them drink. The 70-year-old grandfather said, "I'm going to the bathroom for a drink of water." His wife said, "Sit down, you fool, you'll drown." They were losing their minds. They were close to death from dehydration. But in July, it just so happened that Sea Sweep crossed paths with the Chung family's boat just 120 miles off the coast of South Vietnam, and they were rescued. There was a BBC film crew on board that day, and they actually captured footage as Sea Sweep approached the Chung family's boat.
Can't believe that.
We're packed in there like sardines.
There are 93 people on that boat.
Oh, man.
Stan Mooneyham. There was also a photographer from World Vision present that day. He took this photo. And if you zoom in, right there, that's Vinh Chung. 3 years old at the time his family was rescued. Once they got aboard Sea Sweep, they worked their way back to Singapore Harbor to spend 100 days in a refugee camp in Singapore, waiting for sponsorship, hopefully somewhere in America. On board Sea Sweep, the crew with World Vision decided to host a little church service, passed out Vietnamese language Bibles to anyone who wanted one, and invited anyone who wanted to come up to the deck to attend the church service. Tan Chung was not a religious man, not at all, but he had had an interesting experience during the 6 days aboard the little derelict fishing boat. They were almost dead from dehydration. And suddenly, Mr. Chung got this conviction, this thought out of the blue that he should pray. So he got up, got down on his knees, and he began to pray, "I know there is a creator God, and I don't think you want us to die like this. We need water. Please send rain." Within 15 minutes, there's a dark line on the horizon, clouds roll over, and it starts raining so hard that they're bailing to keep the boat from sinking. So Tan Chung begins to pray again, "Creator God, that's enough water." And so the clouds pass on, and soon the sea is calm again. Then everybody starts to pray. In fact, Vin's grandmother later said, "I prayed to Buddha, I prayed to my ancestors, I prayed to Jesus, I prayed to anyone who would listen." When they got on board Sea Sweep and they held that church service, Mr. Chung, he attended because he thought, these people have come halfway around the world to save my life. It would be rude to say no. And so he showed up, and there he heard the gospel. And he responded, and it stuck. And that was a conviction that he kept for the rest of his life. After 100 days in a refugee camp, they were sponsored by a small Lutheran church in Fort Smith, Arkansas, of all the unlikely places. And that's where the Chung family settled. When you're a refugee and you wait for sponsorship, you have no choice in where you'll end up. You have no choice in what country you'll end up in. And it happened to be the United States, and it happened to be Fort Smith, Arkansas. And so there they were. They came to the U.S., they didn't speak a word of English, and they didn't have a dime. But they did have 8 children, and mom and dad. And they had a sense of family, and they had a sense of calling. And they were going to put all those things to work. There's an expression the Chinese use when they're asking for forgiveness. They say, "Let's drop it in the ocean." It's a good description of what happened to Tan Chung, because he was a playboy, by his own admission, in South Vietnam, and not a very nice man. But he had everything. But by the time he got to America, he had nothing. He had been stripped of everything. So he took the first job that he could find, which was fabricating fiberglass for a minimum wage of $2.90 an hour. And eventually, in a few years, he took a job with Ream Air Conditioning on an assembly line, working for $6 or $7. He did that for the next 23 years. And every year he worked there, he had a raise of 30 cents an hour. He knew he would never again have money. He knew he would never become a doctor as he had once dreamed of. And he would never again be the COO of a rice milling empire. He would just work every day at an assembly line so his kids could have a future that he never had. So you move to the present day, and now you come to Vinh Chung. This is his wife Liesl and their 3 kids. Vinh did okay for himself. For a boy who arrived in America not able to speak a word of English and without a dime to his name, graduated valedictorian from his high school, made all-state in football at offensive guard, though he only weighed 200 pounds, and graduated eventually from Harvard Medical School. He's now a skin cancer specialist in Colorado Springs, and he's on the board of directors with this fledgling hunger relief organization called World Vision. It's a terrific story. There are now 5 doctorates, 5 master's degrees, and 21 university degrees in the Chung family. I'm not a memoirist, but I wrote a memoir because I think this is a story that deserved to be told. This is not a Republican story. When the Chung family came to the U.S., they went on food stamps, and they had government-assisted housing. This is not a Democratic story, because the Chung family got off government relief just as fast as they possibly could and never borrowed money again. This is an American story, and what Vinh likes to say is, this is the story of my family, but this could be anybody's story. This is an American story. And what captured me about this is that I think in the process of coming to the U.S. and sacrificing so very much and accomplishing all that they did, I believe the Chung family became more American than most native-born Americans. What the Chung family learned is that this is not a land of entitlement, but it is still a land of opportunity. But it will depend on how very hard you work. And there's another lesson of this story that I really loved. Just a few years ago, Vinh had a chance to go back and visit Vietnam. See, he was only 3 years old when he left, and he has no direct memories of South Vietnam or the Mekong Delta. But remember, there were 4 boats set adrift that day? The current, the wind, took the other 3 boats back to Vietnam. The extended Chung family was temporarily imprisoned and then released to go back to nothing, because they had no money and their property had all belonged to the government now. And when Vinh went back to Vietnam, to the Mekong Delta, he saw the old rice mills, which were now in disrepair, and he met members of extended family that were living in complete poverty, in shacks with walls covered in newspaper for wallpaper, where the toilet was nothing more than a hole in the ground and a light bulb hanging over it. And Vinh said, as I sat there looking at these people, I thought to myself, this is me. This is my alternate universe if the wind had shifted. If the current had taken me a different direction, this is how I would have lived. I would have spent my life wandering down some dusty road, tapping the haunches of a water buffalo with a bamboo rod. But somehow, by the grace of God, by the providence of God, I ended up in America. And Vinh said, you know, I remember reading growing up when I went to church. Jesus was saying, to whom much is given, much is required. And I used to think, you know, that's true. Those rich people, much is required of them. He said, when I finally stood there in Vietnam looking at my extended family, it suddenly dawned on me, I've always been rich, and much is required of me. So Vinh's message today to people is, give back. You've been blessed. If you even exist in this country, you are a rich person, and we all have an obligation to give back. The book is called Where the Wind Leads, comes out April 22nd from Thomas Nelson.